All right, everyone. I'm back home. It's my week off. I left Missouri, so I went from Texas to Minnesota to Missouri, and I was flying, and now I have a week. So, um, basically, what I want to do today is wrap up this DJI Ban American drone market series. So, what I want to start with today, I'm not gonna, I won't summarize too much, but I basically talked about what I see as the two warring camps within the American drone market, pro DJI, lobbying. I've talked about a middle ground that really sees the harm in both approaches. And then I've talked about the hurdles that need to be overcome in order for there to be a free and effective and productive American drone market, which I do not believe currently exists right now. So, what I'm going to talk about today is where I think this all is headed. This is going to be sort of my conclusion. What I'm going to start with first, because I feel like I haven't defined this clearly, and also because I feel like there's not a lot of material defining this clearly that is out there right now for people. I'm going to talk about what the legislative landscape actually is. It's very confusing. I don't see a ton of great articles about it. Even the articles that I do report on this, I don't feel like they're extremely well sourced. It's difficult to know exactly what is going on. So I'm going to do my best. Again, this is the layman's operator's perspective on this. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a head honcho CEO who has a bunch of people game planning this or whatever you would call it. But I do see what's going on LinkedIn. I see what's going on in the news. I do my best to keep up. So I'm going to do my best to describe the legislative landscape, what the timeline is for the DJI ban, and sort of talk about exactly what that means for that to come into effect. And then also what we're looking at with these tariffs, how those two are going to work together or not. And then I'm going to, like I said, give my conclusions, where I think this all is headed, where do we end up in the next 5-10 years as all this comes into effect. So, without further ado, there are two things right now that are looming which will really curtail the use of DJI drones within the enterprise drone market here in the US. So, when I say enterprise drone market, what I'm referring to is non-military uses. I really am including public safety, so police, fire departments, search and rescue. I am including that, but I am not including military drones. So I'm not talking about the types of uses we're seeing in Ukraine, although there's obviously this dual use market. That's a term people throw around, which is kind of one of these innocuous military terms, dual use. There's obviously a dual use for DJI products, and they are being used in warfare all the time. But for what we're talking about now, the enterprise drone market excludes the military uses. Okay. So, two things that are basically going to curtail enterprise use for DJI drones in the US. First is these tariffs. So, essentially, right, that's this tariff being placed on the import of all Chinese goods with few exceptions. And that will include DJI drones. So DJI drones were not part of the electronics that were excluded from the Trump tariffs. And that could have a massive impact on the use of DJI drones, right? If the price is driven up enough, then people will all of a sudden be forced to go with competitors. And, whether or not those are American manufacturers or they might be a Japanese manufactured drone, or It might be these Anzu drones that are being produced in Malaysia but are essentially DJI drones. That's another sort of caveat, is whether or not DJI can strike these licensing deals where their technology will be essentially replicated by third parties and sold into the US market that way. That remains to be seen whether or not that will be viable and legal, and they can sort of get away with that. So that's a caveat, but I don't think that these tariffs are going to persist at the rate that they're at right now. It does look at the moment that some deal is going to be struck. The ultimate tariff rate is not going to be 138 or whatever percent it is right now. It'll be much lower. And if it is much lower, then I think that DJI's drones, barring any other banning, will still be the best price on the market. I mean, they have room to essentially go up, thousands of dollars and still be more competitively priced than the alternatives. So I think that's very important to consider. We essentially, right now we're looking at a world where the DJI products are just so much better, and they're so much more competitively priced that even if these tariffs come into effect at 50%, let's say, people are still probably going to opt with the DJI drones, not just because they will still be lower priced, but they'll also just be the better product. So that's kind of what the tariff situation is right now. Obviously, if it were to stay at 138%, then that might be a different conversation. The price would, something like a M300 would be maybe close to a free fly system. So in terms of price, and then I'd be like, okay, well, if the M300 is about the same price as the free fly system, then we'll just go with the free fly system because it's American, and it might not do everything that the DJI system does, but it's pretty close and it's the same price, and we'll support American. I think those conversations by companies, not so much law enforcement, will start to happen if the tariffs remain how they are now, but probably not if they're lowered, which it looks highly likely that they will be lowered. So that's kind of the situation with the tariffs. Now, the NDAA situation is a little bit more sticky, and it's also, I think, very convoluted. It's tough to kind of wrap your head around. So the best of my understanding is that there's two aspects to this NDAA, essentially Chinese drone ban that we're looking at. So, and it's unclear. Yeah, so we'll dive into it. So the first aspect is this ban on federal agencies from using DJI drones, and this is essentially going to roll out over the next 2 years. And by 2026, federal agencies, so, the FBI, which I believe the FBI already can't use DJI drones. That's been my understanding for a while. But, people like the Department of the Interior, all these federally funded agencies will no longer have any DJI drones. And I believe that took effect. That's been in effect for at least 2 years now. So, that's the situation with federally funded. The federal government will not be using DJI drones, and that's not any news. That people have known that for a while. I've known that for a while. So, what's going on with the whole enterprise market is there's this question of whether or not DJI will be placed on this FCC covered list. So I guess as part of the legislation that was passed last year, DJI was put on a list of companies that must undergo this audit by the 5 national security agencies. So it has to pass an audit by like the NSA, the CIA, the Department of State, I think the National Security Director's Office or something like that. There's 5 different agencies that can give DJI this audit and sort of give it the thumbs up where it won't be placed on this FCC covered list. And if it is placed on this FCC covered list, then basically no one will be able to buy DJI drones in the US. No new drones will be imported in. It will be sort of this blacklisting of DJI if that were to occur. Now, the tricky part is if there is no audit, then it will be placed on this list. So essentially, if they just don't bother to audit DJI, then this will happen. So DJI is going through this campaign right now to basically like beg to be audited. And by audited, I don't mean financially, I mean a security audit. So I guess for people to comb through their software and determine whether or not there's any national security risk for companies, not just police departments, not just the federal government, but civil engineers, etc. Civil engineers, surveyors, all down the line, construction companies, you name it, all the type of stuff I do. So utilities inspections, energy inspection. I mean, all these industries that are now using these products will be banned from using them if there is no security audit. So that is the situation right now. Now, I see it as highly likely that that will happen, that they will be placed on this FCC covered list just because no one's going to bother to audit them. And I think that's something that Skydio and Brink, they're trying very hard to audit or to lobby for that. And you've also got to look at right now, there are really big partners that are now aligned with both Brink and Skydio. And it's starting not to just be those 2 companies. It's also now Motorola and Axon are linked with them. And those are very big players in the public safety, the police game. So Motorola and Axon both provide a lot of these software solutions and different, I don't mean to minimize it, but gadgets and infrastructure that law enforcement uses all across the country. They're kind of competitors, and they've aligned themselves with these 2 different drone as first responder producers to essentially go head to head in that new market space. So I think it's very likely that to protect those investments, those major players are going to be like, yeah, just put them on the covered list for the sake of this public safety DFR market space, which is obviously very, a huge percent of the drone ecosystem. But while it's percent, it's not the whole ecosystem. So I think a big question is then, okay, what's going to happen to the rest of the drone economy if, for the sake of the public safety drones, everything is, all the DJI stuff is blacklisted? So I think so now I'm, obviously I'm moving kind of, as it turned out, I started interweaving my conclusions into the first part of the video as I had it outlined, but that's okay. So now I'm really going to get to my conclusions. So we have a situation where with the tariffs, I don't think DJI would be ruled out completely. I think, like I said, the tariffs will probably come down, and for just the tariffs, DJI would still be allowed to be a part of the drone ecosystem. And while I think it's very likely that they would, and so then you have to look at, well, we have the public safety stuff, which I think, if you allow DJI to remain in the public safety game, so if you're looking at it from the perspective of Motorola who's now partnered with Brink, or if you're looking at it from the perspective of Axon partnered with Skydio, and you allow DJI to stay in the game, I think you open the door to police departments being like, yeah, we're going to use those. Like, even though there's a 50% tariff, it's still cheaper. It still does exactly what we want it to do. The features are better. The night vision's better. Yada, yada, yada. Even for DFR, there is a DFR ecosystem being built around DJI drones, and it would be cheaper. And I plan on breaking down what DFR is, going to that whole niche in some other videos. There's tons of stuff there, but DFR, for people who don't know, drone is first responder, basically the future of policing as I see it. So, okay, so that's how I see the tariffs allowing. I see the tariffs coming down and allowing DJI to remain as a part of the market. Now, do I think that would be a good thing? And also, do I think that is what's going to happen? I think that would be a good thing. I think that in order to have a truly competitive marketplace, even though it's not good for us to be outcompeted, like you still have to use an analogy, if you're at a wrestling gym and there's this guy who's just the best wrestler at the gym, and you want to become the best wrestler, it's like, okay, are you just not going to wrestle with that guy? Like, you're just going to say, okay, no, he's too good. I can't, I'm just not going to wrestle with him. Well, you're not going to, you're never going to end up beating him if you never wrestle with him. It's not how it works. I mean, so anyways, I think allowing DJI to stay in the marketplace allows us to say, okay, this is the standard that needs to be beat. These are the features that end users love, and that's why they're going to these products. We need to be able to beat them at a better price point. We need to innovate past them. I think if we just legislate our way out of it and say, okay, yeah, no more DJI, can't use their stuff, just the quality is going to come down, and that's not good. I think that having them as a competitor, whether or not it's fair that it's essentially a state-run company and they're not necessarily using free market practices. By that I mean their price setting where their distribution is locked down and there isn't competitive pricing going on with that. Or by competitive pricing, I mean distributors aren't allowed to set their own pricing. There's all these things with DJI that doesn't really make it a true free market, normal company. But that doesn't mean that it's a global economy. It doesn't mean we just get to ban them and move on and live happily ever after. I don't think that is the right solution to this issue. Now, the tariffs, I think, especially if they're not at this crazy level and some deal is reached, I think they will put some penalty on the import of Chinese goods, fine, but will allow them to stay in the marketplace. I think that's ultimately what will spur the most innovation. Now, do I think that's likely? No, not really. I think it's very interesting because, I think there's enough of sort of, we'll say, old school influence on the Republican side. So I think Elise Stefanik is probably the best example. I think she is a wolf in sheep's clothing, or a war hawk disguised as a MAGA Republican type character. And again, I don't want to talk too much about politics, but it is relevant. So I think, and the reason I'm bringing her up is because she's been pushing a lot of this legislation that is really backed by the lobbying efforts of Skydio and Brink. And I think they will be swayed enough to ban DJI. I think it'll be in their interest. They'll look at it as the right play for defense. They'll look at it as the right play for I think really they'll look at it as the right play for defense, and they'll allow that to dictate the whole industry. And I do think that is a really big mistake. And I think what's going to happen if that is the case and DJI gets totally banned is so okay. Let me introduce a new element I wanted to mention earlier, but I didn't. So Congress is also has bills on the floor of the House that are going to essentially give grants, fund innovation and research in the drone space. So they earmarked a bunch of funds that will go to developing drones. Now, my questions are, well, how much of this will go to drones for defense? I think the answer will be a lot. How much of this will go to companies that get bought up by defense primes or Skydio and Brink? I think a lot, especially if the DJI ban were to go through. And I don't know if that's necessarily going to lead to the innovation that we'd like to see. So my fear is that DJI gets banned. We don't have this standard to aspire to, and all this money sort of gets eaten up in the venture capital and the politics, and we don't end up with a robust drone industry here in the US. And so the cynical part of me thinks that is really probably the most likely outcome, is that all this money gets eaten up by software engineers making $400,000 a year, that everything is committed to death, that there isn't a ton of innovation, and that we can't end up producing drones that cost anywhere near what DJI costs now, and that honestly don't have the features. So there's a very cynical part of me that sees that as highly likely. And what's going to happen if that ends up being the case? Well, you know, American soldiers will be trying to use drones in the middle of firefights and they won't work. And police officers will be, launching drones from boxes in the middle of their cities to go do whatever, and they'll fall out of the sky. And or they'll, their links will freeze up. Or the American taxpayer is just going to foot this unnecessarily high bill for these parts of our economy that are not compatible with sort of lean startups and efficient systems where we'll be paying for these executive salaries, paying for supply chains that aren't able to source materials at a competitive price, and we'll be getting at best the same product, but most likely probably not as good of a product. So that's the cynical part of me thinks that that's where this is leading to, is to a DJI ban and to a place where the American taxpayer is footing a bill for essentially inferior technology, and that will essentially play a role in the general demise of our industry and military. So that is the cynical part of me, and obviously that's not what I want to happen, but I do see that happening with some of this legislation that is being forced into place. Now, what am I hopeful for? Well, I think on the state level, so in the Pacific Northwest, in Pendleton, Oregon, and then in North Dakota, and even in Detroit. Although I don't see the Detroit incubator. There's a bunch of these UAS incubators throughout the country. There's one in New York, upstate New York. There's one in Detroit. There's one in Texas. There's one in Oklahoma, actually, like the Choctaw Nation has one. There's a bunch of these UAS incubators. And I see at the state level there being the chance to do some real innovating. And there are people who are building drones that are not a part of this sort of blue UAS list, that are doing their best to source things cheaply to build secure drones. and drones that are also what the end user needs. And I think that's probably going to happen within these state level incubators is probably my best bet. And I think that's great. And everyone within the drone community hopefully will support that. And I do think that there's a lot of grassroots effort and support for those things, and I'd like to be a part of that. However I can help out with that, that's what I want to do. Now, whether or not that will be able to overcome sort of these big players and the big venture capital and all that, I think that remains to be seen. Now, I think it's possible that if we get put in a situation as a country where we see that the drones that are being sold to law enforcement aren't working, or that our military gets put into an actual conflict where they need drones that are working and they need them cheaper and they need a lot of them, then some of these companies that have been kind of left by the wayside may get implemented and spun up to support that need. And so, hopefully we're not in a situation where we need that to happen. But I think that is also an outcome, is where a possible outcome where things get bad enough and there's enough of a urgent need that sort of the dormant or the companies that aren't as well connected but are maybe making better products, they get utilized because of some need that arises. So the other way that I see, or sort of path I see forward, that will allow companies to maybe beat out better funded and more well connected companies, is by doing what DJI does well, which is paying attention to end user feedback and actually talking to the pilots who are doing inspections, who are doing mapping, and figuring out how to create a workflow that rivals DJI's, where a lot of these features that we've come to know and love as drone pilots start to get integrated into these American drones, and figuring out how to make that cost effective. And I think one of the big ways to make it cost effective too, and this is I think another key here, and maybe I'll end with this, a big way of making that cost effective is, at least for the drone industry, reshaping how companies are structured. And I think having a different way of educating drone professionals, and this goes into changing, what will be the path of someone who's building drones for a living? Will it be going to college and getting an engineering degree, or going to, getting their FAA Part 107, building some FPV drones, having a portfolio of that online, and, getting hired? Now, right, I think that person could still be making a very good living without the company needing to shell out what they need to shell out for, a 50-year-old product designer who, has worked at different companies for 20 years, and they need to pay that person $300,000. I think companies that figure that out and are able to build a team that is maybe not of, people with university degrees, but are highly skilled and highly knowledgeable, companies like that may be able to have a competitive advantage in terms of being able to spend more money on materials and more money on their actual production, instead of spending money on having executive teams and all that. And I know I'm harping on that, but I really see that as a major issue within the drone industry, within new tech startups, because it's not just a software company. When you're actually having to build things and sell them to customers, I think it's a lot different than just having I don't think we can run the drone industry like Silicon Valley. I think there are so many more elements that go into fielding drones than just rolling out some software, that I think there's a lot of money to be saved with knowledgeable people who don't necessarily have the education where they require this high level of pay. Now, do they maybe deserve that pay? Well, that's another question, another topic for another day. But I see that as a way to move forward for a lot of these drone companies that aren't going to be getting as much, much of this venture capital funding, as much of this lobbying money. So, yeah, I think that is where we're going. I think it's highly likely that, the bad guys in this situation kind of get what they want, and we end up with a bunch of drones that aren't as effective for a lot more money. And at the end of the day, despite all this funding, really, where is the government getting this money? It's from the taxpayer. So, a lot of our money, and then they'll be purchasing the drones, after spending all this money on research development, they'll be purchasing the drones with American, taxpayer money. So I think it is highly likely that that money gets chewed up in lobbying, gets chewed up by executives, and people who are well connected are able to kind of build a very expensive supply chain and make a lot of money for themselves, but produce inferior products. I do think that's likely. I do think there's a glimmer of hope in these state level incubators, people who are very hands-on, have a ton of product knowledge, have a lot of field experience, and they'll be able to produce something that for the enterprise customers, at least for people who are doing inspection and mapping work, will be so far superior to whatever is being produced by the sort of military defense public safety ecosystem, that there is able to emerge a truly competitive, free market for American drones. So there is a glimmer of hope, but I think it is a long, long road ahead of us. I do think it's likely that DJI's drones get totally banned during this first Trump, these next 4 years of the Trump administration. I think that is very, very probable. I think it's very probable they just don't do the security audit and DJI gets placed on the FCC covered list, and then it's sort of it's not going to be a free-for-all. I think it's going to be more of the same in sort of this industry corporate capture where you have a revolving door between former government officials, DC insiders, taking executive positions at some of these blue listed companies like Brink and Skydio. And it's at the end of the day going to be bad news for the taxpayer, bad news for the American warfighter, bad news for the American cop. And I'm not the only one saying this, but I don't like to be the bearer of bad news. I think that's highly likely. I think for people like myself trying to build a free drone economy within the U.S., people who aspire to that, it's a long road ahead. I do think exploring different options in terms of hiring, in terms of supply chain, and also in terms of just research and development. By pursuing that, I think there's a shot that we can come up with stuff that is competitive, that ultimately, the principles of the free market can prevail, but it's going to be a long, difficult road. So, okay, I know this is another long video. I might try to edit this because I have a little bit of time off this week, so I'll maybe take out some of the dead spots, but if not, I appreciate everyone paying attention. I have had good interaction, good feedback for something like this. I haven't really trying to promote anything. I might do a little bit more of that, but I'm really just trying to get my thoughts out there and see where it takes me. So, yep, I will be back out in the field. I might do something a little more field-oriented for my next video, talking about just everything that goes into traveling and actually operating drones out there. Talk a little bit more about how much I get done in a day, how long inspections take, sort of the amount of data, that just some of the more technical stuff. I think I might make a video or two about that. Also, I want to make some videos about DFR how that ecospace is shaping up. And yeah, and keep talking about different drone issues. If you have anything you think I should talk about, put it in the comments. I'd love to get some feedback from everyone. So with that, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.